Hi. So at this point, we've covered most of the main types of data collection. There are other types. So for instance, we might want to collect written data, or we might want to collect video data of different types. But these are predominantly the main types of data collection that you're likely to engage with. However, what we haven't talked about is the difference between administering these to adults and children. Now, clearly there's a strong ethical issue here, but we're going to cover ethics as a separate topic altogether. So in this video, what we're particularly looking at is the practical adaptations that we need to make to methods so that they become useful and usable with children participants or child participants. So this might be like a really obvious thing to start with, but it is really important. It's the fact that children are not just simply small adults. And there's also not one type of child, so we need to really take into account their age and then think about how that affects the cognitive, linguistic and psychological differences between, let's say, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old and an adult, because there are differences across all of those different ranges. And as such, we're going to have to change our approach for each of those different age groups. That said, there's some real strengths in engaging children as competent informers. And as Cohen and Mannion say in this quote, quite often children like to be engaged. They really enjoy it. They like that feeling of being taken seriously by an adult and having their opinion and value their opinion and value taken into account. Also, if we think about education, the primary recipients of education are children. So whilst the data from teachers is going to be nice and rich, if we leave out children's voices, there's probably something missing in our research. So it's really important for us to think about that and to try to engage children if we can. So there are several key things that we want to think about, and this is going to affect all of the different data collection methods. The first one's attention span, so that's going to vary significantly with age. Obviously, if we're thinking about 17-year-olds or 16-year-olds, they're still minors, but their attention span is going to be kind of comparable to most adults. Whereas if we're dealing with 5-year-olds, we're going to make sure that sessions are shorter, perhaps there are more breaks in there, perhaps there are different ways that we manage it, perhaps we undertake it with more adults in the room as well. We've got to account for developing comprehension. If we ask complex or abstract questions, particularly of younger children, they're simply not going to understand the question, and so we're not going to get the type of answer that we're looking for. We need to be really aware of power dynamics. This is particularly important if we're the teacher. So where you're teaching a class and then you're doing research with them, those children are very likely to want to give you the right answer, the thing that they think you're looking for. Can they get it correct? Can I get it right? And that leads to all sorts of issues in terms of the quality of the data you can collect. And the last thing is really we need to make sure that we make researching with younger people a positive experience. We want them to be engaged. We want them to feel valued. And ultimately, just from an ethical perspective, them coming from or through the process feeling like it was positive is in many ways more important than the data we collect. So whilst both are important, giving a preference, probably it's that the young person feels like they've had a positive experience. So kind of guiding principles, picking up my last point, that child's comfort and engagement is really paramount. We want to reduce the power balance if we can. There's some simple ways of doing that, just kind of giving the students, the children, more ownership of the process, the setting that happens in, the type of language, even how we sit, do we choose a big chair in the room or do we sit on one of the child-sized seats? All of these things has an impact here. The type of language you use is important, are we talking in easy child level appropriate language? Are we explaining concepts? We can use them. If there's a complex concept we need to use, then it's possible for us to do it, but are we explaining it or are we assuming they already know it? We need to leave more time for responses and for processing. That's really key. Very often children will take more time to respond. We might want to think about different modes of communication. Like how do we put things across? Perhaps we get students to draw something, or perhaps we get them to act something out, use a kinesthetic way. So think about all these different forms of communication. It doesn't need to necessarily just be verbal. It's very useful, again, as a guiding principle to try out our approach before we do the primary major research. Sometimes things that you think are going to work well don't, and it's useful to have tried it before we actually get to the research place. And as we've already said, keep things shorter than you might do with adults. Have more breaks in between. So it might be we ask a question and we let the children play for a bit, and then we come back, we ask another question, that kind of thing. There's some different things that we can do to build rapport, and that's really critical. Very often we might want to start a session with just some play, so we get to know the children. And whereas we might do like an icebreaker question with an adult, perhaps for us it might be playing a game with the child or engaging with some play. So perhaps if they're using a sandpit, if they're a small child, we might go and play in the sandpit with them, do some digging alongside them, and then perhaps that's an informal situation where we can start to ask our questions. As we've said, we might want the child to actually choose how that interview or data collection approach happens and where it happens. If the child wants to walk around the space, if the child wants to engage in a particular activity, let them do that so they have some control over it. You need to think about how you adapt your questions, the language, as we said, keeping questions short. We don't, if we can avoid it, want to resort to closed questions. That's a trap that we can fall into. So we simplify the question down to a yes/no answer. We still want to, if we can, keep the question broad enough so that children can give us rich detail. So, as we've said, very often data will come from moving beyond purely verbal questioning. It might be that we do things like photo elicitation. So at that point, what we're going to do is we might take some photos of a class, let's say that's just taken place, and then we're going to do an interview with the child. We'll have a photo from that lesson, perhaps we've taken a photo on our phone or something, and we can show the photo and we can say, hey, what was happening there? I saw you playing da 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 da. And then they can start to give us more detail, and we use that photo or whatever it is as a prompt. We can use narrative approaches. Perhaps we can get them to tell a story, or we can tell a story. We can use semi-structured ways, more open ways. We need to be aware that quite often children might well deviate, particularly younger children. So we could start off with a question, but very often they might start answering it and then start talking about something completely unrelated. And we need to give that space. Perhaps that narrative is going to come back and lead us somewhere, perhaps it won't, but we just need to be aware that these things are going to happen. We might get the child to draw something. So, hey, can you draw what you did in your music lesson today? And then after they've drawn their picture, perhaps we start asking them questions about their drawing. So why did you draw yourself in this pose? Why were you doing this? What was that about? Or why is the teacher like this? Why are they so much bigger or smaller, or whatever the thing is? You might also want to kind of use a play-based approach. So perhaps you have puppets. You could have puppet A saying something, and then you say, what would puppet B say back to this person? And perhaps the child themselves becomes puppet B. They put on puppet B and they let the puppet talk for them. So particularly with younger children, that can be a really nice way of doing it. Or we can start with things like story stems, where we start the answer for them. We have a stem, or we have a series of words, and they use those words to construct their arguments, kind of like a word bank. Let's think about observing children participants. On the whole, this can work very similarly to adults. However, we're going to have more issues over consent. We need to have double consent. We need to have parental consent, but we also need the children themselves to confirm that they agree to take part in that research. Ethically, that can lead to problems, because if we're doing an observation, how do we ensure that we only capture data on the children who've consented or whose parents have consented? And that might lead to problems if we're doing audio or video recording particularly. We'll come on to the next slide, because in the next slide I think we talk about practical considerations. So let's imagine that we've got a group of students which are mixed between those consenting and those non-consenting. That might not be practical. So it might lead us at some points to have to kind of put together false groups. So it might be that a year group has got 3 different classes in it, and we select the students who've got consent and we make kind of a fake class. But that also comes with practical considerations, or actually more philosophical ones. Are we capturing naturalistic behaviour if those children aren't used to being together? So all of these things need balancing and thinking about how we're going to work with them practically, but also what the implications are. We might want to take those 2 approaches which we talked about in observation. So one was participant observation, that's where you take part in the activity. And then we had non-participant observation, that's where we sit back, perhaps at the side or the back of a classroom, for instance. Again, both of these come with pluses and minuses. If we're engaging, that can be really powerful. We start to get under the skin of the activity. But we might also, as an adult, be influencing that activity. Clearly, if we take part in a singing activity or something, we're going to be quite a major impact, just because we're likely to be louder because we're bigger, and we'll change that dynamic. And also having another adult there means that children will act differently. However, if we sit on the side, that also has implications. The children might feel like they're being observed, and therefore they will act differently. All of this needs thinking about kind of really carefully. Think about, if you are going to observe from the side, how do you get introduced to the children? At what point does that happen? And what is it that you're going to say? Why are you there in their learning space? What are you looking for? Are you judging them, or are you doing something else? So think about how you talk about what it is that you're there to do with the children, or perhaps you decide for whatever reason you're not going to do that at all. Whatever approach you take, just think it through. Focus groups. These can be really useful, and particularly with smaller children, they can be better than interviews. So that can be good, and particularly if you're getting children who know each other together, they can feel more confident in that space to talk than if they're, let's say, in a one-to-one situation with a single adult. However, it's normally better to work with slightly smaller groupings than you might do with adults. So kind of 4 to 6 children is a good number for a focus group. You might want to think about choosing groups of children who are regularly together, who know each other. If you grab random children from different places and pop them together as a focus group, that social interaction can be really complex for children in particular, and that might inhibit them from speaking. So just be aware of that. So, for instance, if you're doing a focus group, let's say on an orchestra, you might choose deliberately to stick to one instrumental family, let's say all of the string instruments or all of violins, so those children are used to being in a similar space together. They feel comfortable, or there's a level of comfort between them so that they feel freer to speak. You need to think carefully about the length. Now on here we've talked about kind of 45 minutes as a maximum for 10-year-olds, but clearly we're going to roll that back. If we're working with 5-6-year-olds, then we might want to be significantly shorter than that, more like a 10-minute period. So just think about what that is. Another way of thinking about it is to think about doing a question, getting everyone together, and then doing another activity on top of that, and we'll look at that next. So we might want to really think about facilitating a focus group. One way is to think about perhaps starting with some warm-up games, some improvising, speaking games, things like that. They can be good, so we get people warmed up, we get the children warmed up, used to each other, used to the space, used to you, most importantly. As we discussed, some of these approaches are very similar to interviews, so we might want to do things like drawing tasks. We might use props, stickers, other visual aids like we discussed, photographs, perhaps recordings of music, as prompts to get the children to speak. We might even do kind of movement activities. Let's say we get groups of children to mime what happens in this situation, how do you deal with this, what happens in this situation. So all different ways of doing it. We're kind of facilitating a session, it really is that kind of thing. And we're trying to create a natural, playful discussion. All the time we're trying to get the students to open up to each other so that they feel like they can discuss things openly and freely, and between themselves negotiate the meaning of what's being discussed. Surveys, again, we can administer surveys, but we need to think about it. Obviously your design of your survey is going to be really critical. If it's dense with lots of words and complex questions, that's not a good idea. So you're going to want to go for something that's simple. Think about big fonts, think about white space. You might want to add pictures. If you're doing things like Likert scales where you've got 1 to 5, then you might want to think about smiley faces, neutral faces, sad faces, those types of things. So you're going to make it visually engaging. You're going to want to make sure that the language is simplified, that the questions are shorter. And this is true with adult questionnaire, but it's particularly true with children's questionnaire. You're going to want to make sure they're slightly shorter. And you need to be aware that with completely open questions where you're asking children to write, you need to be aware of their ability to write or otherwise. And it might be that you need to work with the child at that point so that they tell you the answer and you scribe it for them. One approach you might want to think about if you're working particularly with younger children is to get their parents involved. But similar to the issue where you might become the scribe for a child, if we involve parents, which can be a powerful way of doing it, can be a useful thing, we need to be aware that is it the parents' ideas that are going on the form or is it the child's? And obviously, does the child feel like they're free to give the honest answers they want to give or the answer that they think their parent needs or expects to see? So we just need to be aware of those kind of considerations. Let's just think about power dynamics. They're there. We've discussed these a little bit, but there's some key things we can do. As we said, first of all, perhaps allow the children themselves to decide where they sit and how they sit. Let's say we're going to a school hall. You place the seat somewhere, they might think traditionally that's not where they should sit. So from the beginning, from the get-go, they might feel uncomfortable about that. So it's best to let them choose. Say, hey, where should we set up the seat? Should we sit as a circle or would you like to face me? Those kind of things can help immediately to start to break down the power dynamics. It's giving them voice and it's saying that actually you're listening to them and their ideas. As we said, think carefully about the kind of seat you sit on. You know, if the kids are sat on benches, do you sit on a bench as well or do you choose a chair? Are you trying to differentiate yourself? Are you trying to fit in at some level? Psychologically, all these things are important. Think about the language you use, but also the tone of voice that you use. Are you loud? Are you quiet? Are you smiling? All of these things are really important. You need to really acknowledge when children give you ideas. That can be difficult because we don't want to lead the conversation. We don't want leading questions. We don't want to be encouraging the answers that we're looking for. But equally, our body language is really important here, and acknowledging when children are giving you good answers can be really powerful. So there's a subtle balance to play, but I think it's really important that you do that. You need to allow children the space to redirect. Cognitively, they just might need some time out. So sometimes they themselves might break the conversation. So they're talking about something and all of a sudden they start telling you about what they did at the weekend or their dog or something completely unrelated. And it's really important that you allow the child to do that and you just accept that you're deviating at this point. And it might not be in your plan, but you're going to have to go with that. And I think that's really important. And it links to that last point about respecting the child's pace and boundaries. There's always time afterwards. You listen to them respectfully. If they're talking about their dog, you'll have a nice conversation about their dog, and then perhaps you try to naturally move the conversation back to the thing you're looking to discuss. Kind of picking up on some of these things, really building trust. You need to show genuine interest in that child. You're there clearly to collect your data, but you can't really treat that child as a data point. They're a human being, and that's particularly important with children. So you need to engage them as humans first. As we said, we might want to engage with some play first. Perhaps, if there's some building blocks in the classroom, or perhaps it's just an informal conversation to begin with. So what were you doing with the day? What have you been up to? Oh, who did you play with? What games are you playing on the playground? Or what's your favourite subject at school? All of those kind of things. You get involved with the child first to show that they're valued. You need to be patient. You need to be non-judgmental. They might give answers you're not looking for, not expecting. That might be answers related to your research that you're not expecting, or it might be answers completely unrelated. Either way, you need to treat them all with respect. And that kind of links to this idea of invite rather than overrule. We're inviting a child to be part of this, and ultimately, even if we spend half an hour, let's say, with the child and we get very little data from them, it's very, very important that we respect that they've been in that space with us, which might have been quite a big deal for them. So even if we're not getting the data we need to ensure that at the point where they leave that room, that they feel comfortable, they feel like they've had a positive experience, and that their time's been valuable to you. So yeah, bring it all together. All methods can be used with children, and there's some key things that we're going to do, power imbalance, make sure things are age appropriate, keep things shorter, perhaps think about multiple modes of communication, do some piloting. So all of these things are key. There are challenges to working with children and doing data collection with children, it's true. Older children, it's more straightforward in some ways, but can be more challenging in others. But I think it's so vital to have children's voices in your research. If you're researching education, they really do know it from the inside. They understand what's going on. Sometimes at quite a deep level, they suss a lot of things out. So their voice is essential in our research. And if we can develop skills to interview, to observe, to lead focus groups effectively with children, then that can be really powerful and really help you as a researcher to get to the core of what's happening in a learning situation. So I would encourage you to think about how you really actively engage children in your research. Once again, there are some core texts. Some of these we'll talk more or less. Really think about education books, possibly more so than the core research books, but most of them will talk about dealing with other participants. We haven't talked about people with disabilities or other needs, but there are similar challenges there, or related challenges at least. So we need to be really aware of different participants we might work with, whose voices are all vital in our research, and how we manage that. So I would urge you to go and do some more research if this is something you want to do. Find out more at a deeper level exactly what you need to do to better plan, to be aware, and to be ready for undertaking this type of interview. Anyway, I hope that this series of videos on research methods has been useful and has given you some ideas about how you might go about collecting data for your own research projects.